Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Thanks for coming along as we work on my 1965 Chevy Bel Air. Today we're going to be doing an ignition tune-up and a carburetor tune-up because it runs like garbage. You probably remember from a few videos ago I had a hard time keeping it running. It wanted to stall on me, and I did some poking and prodding over the next couple of days and found that dwell was a little below spec. And vacuum was also pretty alarming. You can see this needle bouncing back and forth. This is indicative of an ignition system problem. So we're going to service the ignition system, and we're also going to adjust the carburetor to get where we need to be. We're going to be following the 1965 Chevrolet service manual for all of our specifications and the procedures. This is way better than Google. I highly recommend these manuals. They have all the numbers and specs you need. So as part of this tune-up, we are going to be replacing parts. We're going to replace the spark plug wires, the ignition coil, the distributor cap, the distributor rotor. We're going to replace the points and condenser. We're also going to replace all 8 spark plugs and the voltage regulator. Now, the voltage regulator is because it was overcharging a few weeks ago. More on that later. To begin, we're going to mark cylinder 1 on the spark plug wires. It just helps me, I mean, this isn't necessary, but it helps me keep track of the spark plug wires firing order when we reassemble. I just like knowing where cylinder 1 is. It's helpful. Now we're going to remove the spark plug wires from bank 2. Coil those up on top here. Now we'll come and remove the bank 1 spark plug wires. Pop, off it goes. And we'll go ahead and remove the distributor cap. There's just 2 fasteners on each side, little L-shaped bolts. They're not bolts. And here's the distributor rotor underneath. This is actually in really good shape. I replaced this rotor 10 years ago, and it's held up really well. This cap I also replaced 10 years ago. It's got 16,000 miles on it. You can see some green fuzzies on the terminals, but it's really not bad. So let's go ahead and remove the rotor so we can see the vacuum advance mechanism underneath, and we'll check it to make sure it's not binding. Here's a closer look at this rotor. You can see it's really in good shape, so I'm not going to get rid of it. I'm going to keep it in case I need it later. It's still usable. So the manual actually instructs you to check the centrifugal advance mechanism right here by moving it like so and letting it snap back into position. That proves it's not binding, so looks pretty good. You can see the points and condenser underneath. Now this next step is really important. We're going to check the operation of the vacuum advance. So we're going to hook up a vacuum pump to the diaphragm and just slowly apply vacuum and make sure that the advance moves fully from stop to stop. So we'll apply vacuum and release. It's looking pretty good. It's working properly. So we'll slip the hose back on there and move on. So now let's go ahead and remove the ignition coil. We'll start by pulling the power and ground circuits off. We'll do this, the one I'm working on right here is the ground side. Go ahead and set that aside. And we'll go ahead and loosen up the power side and get that off. Now this is the clamp that holds the ignition coil to the engine. Just a flathead screwdriver, and that also that'll come right off. Looks a little crusty, a little old. This is an old O'Reilly brand ignition coil. It still works, but I don't trust it. It's old. It's older than I've owned the car. Now, I was a little dismayed that there's no terminal or eyelet on the end of the power circuit for the coil. I don't have one, so we'll just have to make do. Alright, with that out of the way, next let's go ahead and remove the points. Now there's 2 screws that hold the points down to the distributor body, and then there's another screw right here that holds the circuits to the points. So we'll go ahead and slip that off. And once that's out of the way, we can remove the second screw that holds the points assembly to the distributor. And we'll remove that. And while we're in here, it's a good idea to check for excessive looseness on the distributor, and I didn't find any. So we're good to keep using the distributor we have. Now let's go ahead and remove the condenser. All right. So here's our old points and condenser assembly sitting next to our new one. You'll notice they don't look the same. That's okay. The one I pulled off the car is just a different style where they're separate. But check out this point set. Look at how burnt these points are. This is why Dwell was out of spec. These points are burnt and they're burning into each other, and yeah, I had to play with this a little bit. But you can see that they're worn. Now the nice thing about the Chevys is you can adjust the point gap with this screw right here, and it moves the backing plate and that adjusts the gap. You can do it with the engine running, which is a big advantage over some other engines from Ford and Chrysler, and which require disassembling the distributor each time to reset dwell. Now, the new assembly looks great. It will fit just fine. The only disadvantage here is you can't get a feeler gauge in between the points to set the point gap. So we'll have to just eyeball it and then fine tune it with the dwell meter later once we get the car back together. But that won't be a big deal at all. So let's get this new points and condenser assembly installed in the distributor here. We'll just slip the base of the assembly around the screws and tighten it down. There's a little index tooth on the bottom of the assembly plate that indexes it, so you can't really mess this up if you're paying attention. So we'll snug down these two screws. Now we'll come back over here and we need to put the circuit on for the ignition coil. And this is actually the wire that triggers the ignition coil. This provides a ground circuit for the ignition coil, and when the point's open, breaks the circuit, which results in spark. And there's our new points and condenser assembly installed. And we're going to need a set point gap. So I'm going to rotate the engine until the breaker arm is at the top of one of the distributor lobes, so that the point gap is at its widest, most open point. And from there, we will use the adjuster screw to set the gap. Now we're going to have to eyeball this because I can't get the feeler gauges in there. So later when we're running the engine, we'll just use the dwell meter and adjust the screw right here to set the dwell to 30 degrees. So let's get this new ignition coil installed. Much less crusty. However, it is about 3 millimeters thicker than the previous coil, so it gave me a little bit of a hard time. I ended up pulling the screw out of the clamp, the bracket there, and spreading it so that it would sit in there nice and tight. That'll do for now. And with the circuits installed, we're ready to roll here. Let's get the new rotor reinstalled inside the distributor. And now we can go ahead and get the spark plugs out. So we'll quickly buzz these things out. They actually don't look too bad. A little oily, a little dirty. But here's our new ones. Nice and clean. We need to make sure that each of them are set to 35 thousandths of an inch gap. There was a few that I had to adjust. It really wasn't too bad though. These spark plugs generally require a little adjustment, even right out of the box. Here's the 4 that we're going to put on bank 1. And that's it as far as the primary and secondary side, with the exception of the distributor cap and the wires. We need to get these installed. I always like to start by putting the coil wire on, and then I like to organize the short and long wires so that I can see them and grab them easily. And when we go put the distributor cap on, I like to have cylinder 1 already installed just to mark it, because what we're going to do is we're going to install each wire in firing order. So we'll start with cylinder 1, and we'll just follow the firing order all the way around the engine. This is the easiest way to do it. It's foolproof. You're not going to mess it up because you're just going to move on to the next post on the distributor cap all the way around until you come back around to the final cylinder. And we'll get those clipped up out of the way, nice and pretty. And there we have it. We're ready to start this engine and set dwell. So here's my multimeter. I'll set it to the dwell setting. And then the little red range button here, I will select 8 cylinder so that it gives us the appropriate reading. And after a little fiddling, I was able to get this thing back to 30 to 31 degrees. That's perfect. So close that. This thing runs so good. So let's finish it off by adjusting the carburetor. I didn't get a whole lot of footage of this. However, we're going to set idle speed and idle mixture. So here's the idle speed screw. And these are the mixture screws. There's 2, one for each barrel. So we'll follow the procedure to seat them all the way, then back them off until we get a smooth vacuum, which we have accomplished here. Look at that. So much better than it was. This runs a lot better. It shifts nice and strong, and it doesn't stall anymore when you put it in gear. Now, hold on a minute. What in the world is that? That would be a battery light. While we were running the engine, setting dwell, the alternator failed. So we're not going to install a voltage regulator today, but we can still take it for a spin around the block and celebrate our fresh new tune-up. We'll be doing the alternator and voltage regulator in a future episode. In the meantime, I really hope you enjoyed. I sure did. We've got lots more to do on this old Bel Air, so stay tuned for more, and I'll catch you in the next one.